Hi, I'm Chuck Olenek. When I started filming bits of California history and looking at landmarks, I was doing it from the perspective of a reenactor, and also I taught history for 36 years. So here I am running around doing this filming, and I guess my mindset's about trying to preserve pieces of history before they disappear. So I started with missions and assistencias and presidios, and it was amazing how much of that stuff disappeared or had to get recreated. And then I started following the careers of outlaws. But there was this one category that I had, because I'm obsessive that way. I had to create categories. There's this one category I had called California's Living History. I don't necessarily do it as a reenactor. I'm trying to just save the pieces or try to understand the stories behind certain events or, certain places. And this one's going to be a little different. What I'm doing is I'm going to be talking about the Virginia Dare Winery. Now, there's a number of them, all right? One's up in Geyserville, California. There's a number of them. But I'm talking about the one it's on Route 66 and Haven in what used to be called Cucamonga before the population boom, and it became Rancho Cucamonga. I hope you stick with me. The history of Southern California winemaking began when the first vineyards were planted in Cucamonga back in 1839. The Mission San Gabriel Archangel had established the Rancho Cucamonga as a site for grazing their cattle. But in 1839, the 13,000-acre rancho was granted by the Mexican governor of California, Juan Bautista Alvarado, to Tiburcio Tapia, a wealthy Los Angeles merchant. Tapia, who was also a dedicated soldier, smuggler, and politician, transferred his cattle to Cucamonga and built a fort-like Adobe house on Red Hill. In time, the communities of Ontario and Upland developed out of part of the rancho lands, and the unincorporated communities of Alta Loma, Cucamonga, and Etiwanda would become the city of Rancho Cucamonga. Tapia planted grapevines in 1839, establishing the Cucamonga Winery, which was known for a sweet port, the first in California and the second oldest in the United States. In 1859, rancher John Raines began large vine plantings in Cucamonga, introducing agriculture on a large scale to replace traditional cattle and sheep raising in the region. By the way, Raines was found murdered in 1862 in San Dimas. This might have been one of the first murders by the famed California bandido Procopio. Okay, so vineyards are getting planted, and this is where the Virginia Dare Winery comes in. Actually, it was called the Mission Winery, and there's a couple of different origin stories about the building itself, or the buildings themselves. One version is in 1908, Chinese laborers built it, and they worked on a number of other projects, including like an aqueduct that's above Cal State San Bernardino. Okay, then there's the other story. The other version is that it was designed by Arthur Burton Benton, who was the architect of the Mission Inn in Riverside, and built by John Klusman, some say Henry Klusman, and M.E. Post in 1910. They had purchased about 750 acres on which they had planted vineyards several years earlier. The result was a sturdy and impressive structure known as the Mission Winery. The deep, sandy soils of Cucamonga made it more or less immune to the attack of phylloxera, a grapevine-eating aphid, at a time when vineyards nearly everywhere else in California were being rapidly destroyed. By 1911, the winery was in full production with over 750 acres of vineyards, second in size only to Guasti Vineyards in Ontario. Inside the winery were the large redwood tanks, some holding 52,000 gallons, in which the grape juice was stored and fermented in the old tradition. Post enclosement, maybe they lost interest in winemaking, or maybe they got a really great offer, but what they ended up doing is they ended up selling to an East Coast company, Garrett and Company, and they bought the land outright in 1918. Garrett was famous for its Virginia Dare wine, the first white wine produced in the United States. It was named for the first white child born in the Americas. Before long, the Mission Winery was known as the Virginia Dare. Before the 1920s, there were like 80 wineries that were producing wine grapes in the Cucamonga Valley, and that was more than Napa was producing or Sonoma was producing. Okay, then Prohibition hits. When Prohibition started in 1920, it shut down the regular operation of wineries, but did not necessarily put an end to them. The winery still produced concentrated grape juice, which was shipped to the East Coast, where it was marketed to home winemakers. One of the contradictions about Prohibition was that it allowed individual households to produce over 200 gallons of wine. That was for personal use. And amazingly enough, the sales of wine grapes skyrocketed at that point. There were many wine tonics made during Prohibition, but you had to request a prescription from your pharmacist. Once Prohibition ended, the winery operation went back to work and it was in full swing. By 1939, it was selling 2 million gallons of wine per year in specially designed tank cars to Garrett's operations in the East. There, the wine would be blended with other wines to make the company's products. All right, so Paul Garrett dies in 1940. That's going to become important later. And the Virginia Dare Winery is still going to be producing wine up until 1960. Let's throw in, okay, Paul Garrett dies 1940. 1941, U.S. enters the war. The Virginia Dare Winery made its contribution to the war effort by handing over the pomace that was produced by the wine grapes. Because the pomace actually was like a good source of potassium, and that was very useful for making explosives. With the end of World War II, the number of wineries are going to decrease. And the reason for that, it's not that people aren't drinking wine, it's that there is a lot of pressure from a very swiftly growing Los Angeles and a very swiftly growing Orange County. People want land. People want housing. And so the land that used to grow grapes, that's being sold off. Remember that part where I mentioned, okay, Garrett died in 1940, that would be important? Okay, it's 1961. The Garrett family members cannot decide what to do with the property, cannot agree, and what they're going to end up doing is they're going to end up abandoning it. Well, there's going to be a fire which is going to gut the inside of one of the buildings, and that's when Hollywood, more specifically TV Hollywood, ended up discovering the winery. So here's this abandoned winery, right? The abandoned buildings. There's been fire in one of them, and that gutted, the buildings. So for some people, it's an eyesore. For Hollywood, it was a great backdrop. TV shows could be filmed there. In 1964, the series Combat, they filmed an episode here called The Hunter, and so you've got the burned building and all that stuff. It looked like war-torn Europe. And in 1967, the Rat Patrol, they did an episode, the Fire and Brimstone Raid. And, so now this place became a substitute for North Africa. And there was also the Invaders, in 1967. And in 1970, there was an episode of Mannix, A Chance for Roses, that was... It had to have been one of the episodes where he's going back to his hometown to argue with his, Armenian dad. So, at least it was getting put to use. So, 1970s, more urbanization, more land being sold off to houses or, housing tracts, strip malls. And there's interest now in trying to preserve the Virginia Dare Winery, because it was a fairly unique building and it'd been a part of Cucamonga like forever. Except there were some problems, with like the original walls. Whether you go with the Chinese laborer theory or other construction, these walls were not up to code. They wouldn't make it because they're not reinforced. But efforts were made to at least transform this and build around it, and at least preserve the look and some of the walls. And what you have now is a professional center, with medical offices and that sort of thing. Well, okay, off to find something else that's old and tell a story about it. Until the next time, bye.